Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Miles, for organizing this event and for flying in Dan Wallace to beat my rear side all over the stage. Appreciate that very much. Seems like there are a lot of students here. Am I right? How many of you have had a class with me before? How many of you never want to take a class with me? Right, okay. How many of you in here, students or otherwise, would consider yourselves to be Bible-believing Christians? Right, that would be all of you. How many of you do want to see me get creamed? Right. Let me stress something at the outset. This debate is not a debate about the validity or the importance of the Bible. Nothing that I say will be directed against anybody's belief. I will not be arguing a view that opposes the Bible in the least. Quite the contrary, the position I will be staking out is the view held by a very wide range of Bible scholars, many of whom are deeply committed Christians, as well as a number of deeply committed Christians who are not Bible scholars. The initial question seems to be missing from our overhead. Projector? Yes, we're sailing in Greece, trying to find our togas. So far, I'm having fun. How about you? Thank you very much. And with that, let me conclude. The topic of our discussion is the original New Testament lost? There is a very simple and forthright answer to that question, and I think Dan Wallace, in fact, will not disagree. The answer is yes. We do not have the originals of the New Testament, period. In order to understand what I mean by that, we have to realize how books were made in the ancient world. In the ancient world, when the Bible was produced, books could not be mass-produced. This was before electronic publication, Kinkos, or the printing press. Books were written by hand, and they were copied by hand. If you wanted a copy of a book, somebody had to copy it for you, or you had to copy it yourself. You copied it one page, one sentence, one word at a time. What happens when somebody sits down to try to copy a book by hand? Invariably what happens is they make mistakes, either on purpose or accidentally. Scribes who copied texts in the ancient world changed their texts. Let me explain how it worked by giving an example from the New Testament, the Gospel of Mark. We're not sure who Mark was, when he lived, where he lived. Whoever he was, he wrote a gospel. If anybody wanted a copy of this Gospel of Mark, they had to make a copy by hand, and so they did so. But invariably, they made a mistake or two or three or 20. When someone came along who wanted a copy of that copy, they copied the copy and they replicated the mistakes that the first copyist made. And they made their own mistakes. And then when a third person came along to copy the copy of the copy, they replicated the mistakes of both of their predecessors and made mistakes of their own. And it went on like this, week after week, month after month, year after year, decade after decade, century after century. The only time mistakes got corrected in the process was when somebody was copying something and realized that there was a mistake and thought that his predecessor had made a mistake and so tried to correct the mistake. The problem is there's no telling whether a person who corrected the mistake corrected it correctly. It's possible that he corrected the mistake incorrectly, in which case you have three forms of the text. The original text, the text that was changed, and the incorrect correction of the change. Things like that go on for a very long time. We don't have the original copy that Mark made. We don't have the first copy. We don't have copies of the copy. We don't have copies of the 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 copies. The earliest copy that we have of Mark dates from around the year 200, probably about 130 years after the original. That's the first copy that we have, 130 years after the original. We don't have the originals of Mark or of any other book of the New Testament. The bigger question, though, is not whether we have the originals. The question is whether we can reconstruct the originals that have been lost. Can we reconstruct them or not? For many years, I thought that the answer was yes. That's going to be Dan's answer. But scholarship changed, and it became widely thought among scholars that we cannot reconstruct the original, and that it does not even make sense to talk about the originals. I started to understand why, and now I'm convinced. I can't give the full argument here, but I can mention three major questions that all point in the same direction. These are three problems in dealing with what I'm calling the original text. Problem one will be, what does it even mean to use the term original text? Problem two, where are the early manuscripts of the New Testament? And problem three, why can't scholars agree? So these are the three problems that I'll talk about in my 30 minutes with you. What does it even mean to use the term original text? I'm going to use one book of the New Testament as a particular example, 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians is one of the letters written by Paul to his congregation in the city of Corinth, one of the Pauline epistles. It can illustrate well why scholars are reluctant these days to talk about the original text on theoretical grounds. To begin with, we are missing the original. Whatever Paul wrote, we no longer have it. Our earliest copy of 2 Corinthians is a manuscript called P46. It dates from around the year 200. 2 Corinthians was probably written sometime in the 60s, and so we're talking about a manuscript that was 140 years after the original is our first manuscript of it. And it's not a complete manuscript. Our first complete manuscript of 2 Corinthians does not come until about the year 350. In other words, nearly 300 years of copying, with mistakes being made everywhere along the line before we have the first complete copy. So that's obviously a problem, but it's not the big problem I want to talk about. There are theoretical problems with even imagining what it might mean to call a text the original text of 2 Corinthians for several reasons. First, this first thing it might seem a little picayune and trite to you, but in fact it's actually kind of interesting. We have good evidence that Paul dictated his letters to scribes who wrote down what he said. In other words, he didn't write himself, he dictated. We have solid evidence of this in the New Testament itself. We also have solid evidence from antiquity that when scribes took dictation, they often made mistakes. They misheard a word, somebody in the room coughed, or they didn't hear it right, they weren't paying attention, they wrote something down wrong. Suppose Paul dictated what we're calling 2 Corinthians, and the scribe wrote down wrong words. What is the original text? Is it the words that Paul spoke, or the words that the scribe wrote down? We don't have access to what Paul spoke, just what was written down, but what was written down might have had mistakes in it. Moreover, suppose what happened was what happened frequently in the ancient world, which is that the author looked at the written text once it had been written down and made corrections to it. Then what is the original text? Is the original text what the scribe originally wrote, or is it what Paul corrected? If it's what Paul corrected, then we're in the ironic situation that the later form of the text is being called the original text. And that could have happened a lot. But as I said, you might think that's a kind of a minor matter, and it's not the biggest problem. It's just an interesting problem. There's a bigger problem with respect to Paul writing 2 Corinthians, which is that Paul did not write 2 Corinthians. Paul did not write the letter of 2 Corinthians as it has come to us today. Scholars have long recognized for over a century that 2 Corinthians is made up of at least 2 different letters that have been spliced together. Chapters 10 through 13 do not come from the same letter as chapters 1 through 9. Not only that, there's a large number of scholars in both the United States and in Europe who maintain that 2 Corinthians, in fact, is made up of 5 separate letters that Paul wrote. In other words, Paul wrote 5 letters, and they were put in circulation and were copied and changed. 5 letters. These were circulated and changed until somebody created our 2 Corinthians by taking parts of these 5 letters and cutting them and pasting them together. This is a standard view in scholarship. You will find this taught in every major research university in North America, what I'm telling you now. This is not some kind of crazy idea that a particularly liberal professor at Chapel Hill thinks, although it is that. But it's not just that. This is standard fare in virtually everybody who's a critical scholar agrees with what I've just told you. But what does that mean then? Somebody created the letter some years, maybe a couple of decades after Paul wrote, so that Paul didn't create 2 Corinthians. Paul created up to 5 letters that had been in circulation and probably changed that were then combined into 2 Corinthians with a lot of the stuff cut out and other stuff put together. Then this letter, this amalgam, is put in circulation, and it's changed over time. And then something else happens that's equally significant, even more significant. It was argued over 50 years ago by one of the great scholars of the world of textual criticism, a man named Günther Zuntz, that around the year 100, some editor came along and collected the letters of Paul into one manuscript. That there were separate letters that were floating around, being transmitted here, there, and the other, and somebody collected them into a collection, and this collection was published. This editor who collected the letters put the letters together and possibly put his own stamp on them. In other words, edited these letters to make them fit together into the collection. And then it was the collection that was put in circulation. Zuntz argued that all of our letters of Paul go back to that collection. This is not a weird point of view by just one particular scholar. Günther Zuntz's view has been supported by scholarship ever since, most recently supported, for example, by a very important book written by Harry Gamble, who, I'm sorry to say, teaches at the University of Virginia. But he's a nice guy anyway, and he's very smart, and he's one of the most recent people to argue this, that the Pauline letters were not circulated just individually around the year 100, they're put into a collection, and that all of our manuscripts of the letters of Paul go back to that collection. Or there may have been even more than one collection. But the Pauline letters were not circulating individually, they were circulated in collection, and as they circulated in the collection, of course, they got changed as scribes changed the manuscript. And so this leads us to the very pressing problem: what is the original of 2 Corinthians? It's a great question, and there's not an easy answer to it. There are a couple of obvious options. You could say that 2 Corinthians was the original letter that Paul wrote. Well, apart from the problems of dictation, you've got the problem that Paul didn't write a letter. Paul wrote 5 letters, or 3, or 2. He wrote several letters, and 2 Corinthians was not one of them. 2 Corinthians was a later amalgam made by a later editor of Paul. So the original writing of Paul is not the original 2 Corinthians. So maybe you could say that the copy that was later created by cutting and pasting is the original 2 Corinthians. Well, you could say that, but Paul didn't write that. He wrote the individual letters that were later cut and pasted together. Moreover, we don't have access to this letter that was made by combining these various letters. What we have access to is the collection, because we don't have manuscripts that go back to the letters that were circulating independently before the collection. All of the manuscripts that we have go back to the collection. We can't get behind the collection. And so, what is the original? And who is to say? We can't reconstruct anything before the collection was made, because we don't have any manuscripts that go back to those individual letters before that event. But if we try to reconstruct the original form of the collection, that's not the original form of the text that Paul himself wrote. Moreover, the one letter we're interested in the collection, 2 Corinthians, was not one letter, but 3 or 4 or 5. This is a very confusing situation, but it's the historical reality, which is one of the reasons why top scholars throughout the English-speaking world have abandoned the idea that we can reconstruct some kind of original text. It's impossible to know even what it means to speak of an original. And 2 Corinthians is not the only problem.